Hello, today we're looking at ways of reducing unwanted energy transfers in systems or in fact appliances and various things maybe around the home. Now the first thing to think about is a recap on the previous video. So here we've got a filament lamp that provides light and we transfer energy into the filament lamp, and what we say is that the energy is dissipated. The energy transferred to the lamp is dissipated. In other words, it means spread out. And in this case, in terms of the lamp, it's spread to light energy, which actually eventually carries it away and is eventually transferred as heat. And we have the direct transfer of heat energy as well. So we end up with spreading the energy throughout the environment as heat. Now we often describe that heat energy as wasted because it has been transferred in a non-useful way. There we go. Energy transferred in a non-useful way, often referred to as wasted because it's energy we don't find useful and we don't need. Another way in which we can transfer energy in a non-useful way is when we have moving parts. Now there are lots of different kinds of machines and gadgets that have moving parts, and if they have moving parts, those parts will often rub together, and when they rub together we get friction, and as a result of that friction we get heat energy from the rubbing of those parts. That heat energy is often not useful, and we can describe that as heat. We often get sound along with that as well, as you just heard. We can actually do something about that though. If we have those moving parts, we can use, in this example, we have some oil, but we can use the oil and we can use that as what's called a lubricant. And a lubricant has the job of reducing friction. So we place some oil between those moving parts, and as you can see, those parts will move much more freely and there will be less friction and less sound. So the use of a lubricant means we'll get less friction, and if we get less friction, we're going to get less heat energy transferred and therefore also less energy wasted. We'll also get less sound as well. The lubricant contributes to less sound and therefore less energy is wasted. So we have more useful energy transfer and less unwanted energy transfers. And that's by the use of a lubricant. What we can do now is look at a few examples where we use lubrication or we use insulation to reduce unwanted energy transfers. Okay, so we're going to look at a few examples. These you don't necessarily have to memorize, but you do have to think about how lubrication and insulation will contribute to less unwanted energy transfer. So we're going to focus around on the idea of lubrication and insulation. Let's just tidy that up like that. And here we go. So the first example is that of a kettle. Now I'm sure you're all familiar with a kettle. The job of a kettle is to heat water, and inside there we have a heating element which will transfer energy to the water, but that water will also heat up the edges of the kettle or the walls of the kettle, and that will transfer energy to the surroundings, and that energy is an unwanted energy transfer. We can do something about that. We can use insulation, and that will reduce the amount of energy transferred to the surroundings. But we don't often use insulation on kettles, but anywhere where we have an example of water needed to be kept hot, insulation would be a great way to reduce the unwanted energy transfers, in other words, to reduce wasted energy. Another example is that of a car. Now, a car has lots of moving parts in the engine, and because we have those moving parts, we can use the idea of lubrication, and as you may know, engines contain engine oil, and the whole point of the engine oil is to reduce the friction between the moving parts. That contributes to reduction of heat and also the reduction of sound. We still do get we still do get heat generation, we do get sound, but it's reduced because of the oil. Incidentally, cars are also streamlined, and that means we have less drag and less energy is transferred through friction with the air. Cars also have moving parts, for example the wheels, and we often use grease in the wheels to reduce friction, to reduce the rubbing of the metal parts in the wheels, and therefore less heat energy transferred to the surroundings as well as a result of less friction. Okay, another simple example is that of a bike. We have moving parts on a bicycle, so those moving parts are around the wheels, around the gears and around the pedals. And as you might be getting the hang of this by now, as you may guess, we use oil or grease around those moving parts, and that will reduce friction and therefore less energy transferred as heat. Okay, so that's another example, and one final example is a slight combination. Here we have a washing machine, and a washing machine used to wash clothes. We need to have heat to heat the water, but we also have moving parts in there as well. So by now, hopefully you get the idea. In terms of the moving parts, we can use lubrication, oil or grease. And in terms of the heat, we want to keep as much heat in the machine as possible to heat the water and the clothes, to wash them. So we would have insulation in order to reduce heat transfer to the surroundings, and the moving parts we would use lubrication. Okay, so there we go, lubrication and insulation in our washing machine. So the idea basically is that we can often use lubrication and insulation in order to reduce unwanted energy transfers in appliances or various gadgets that we use around the home. The next part I want to look at is an experiment that you might have done, and it's all to do with the idea of thermal conductivity. Thermal conductivity. And this is the property of a material related to how well it conducts heat energy. And this is an experiment that you might have done in class. What we have are some metals. So in this case, I've just labeled them metal A, B, and C. At the end of each metal, we have some wax. Sometimes you can use grease, but we have wax in this case. And we have drawing pins attached to the end of the rod by the wax. What we can do is we can heat one end of the metal rod, and we can measure the time it takes for the wax to melt and therefore for the pin to drop. So we measure the time for the pin to drop, and that will tell us how good a conductor that metal is. The faster the pin drops, or the quicker the pin drops, that's the quickest time, and therefore that's the material or the metal with the highest thermal conductivity. Now, before we move on to the final part of this video, I just want us to be thinking about some practical skills that we need to know about and understand for our exam. And what I want you to think about here is, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? What are the control variables? So the control variables are the ones that we keep the same to make it what we call a fair test. And what type of graph would we draw of the results of this experiment? Okay, so I would suggest you pause here, think about what the independent and dependent variable is, what the control variables are, and the type of graph we would have. So if you weren't sure, we can go through that together. The independent variable is the type of metal, the dependent variable is the time for the pin to drop. We have various control variables, that's the length of the metal, the weight of the pin at the end, the amount of wax or grease, that's quite important, and the heat supplied to each of the metals. All of these are things that we should keep the same. And in terms of the type of graph, well, it's going to be a bar graph, and the reason for that is that the independent variable is a metal. It's not measured by numbers, so we call that a categoric variable. So we would have a bar chart. The metal would be along the bottom, and along the side we would have the time taken for the pin to drop, and we would have various lengths of bars on our bar chart. And the very final thing now I want to look at for this video is the idea of the rate of cooling of buildings, and that depends on two things. One is the thickness of the walls, and the second thing is the thermal conductivity of the walls. So hopefully you've got the idea now that thermal conductivity is related to how well a material conducts heat. And the pattern is, or the relationship is, that the higher the thermal conductivity, the faster heat is going to be transferred, and therefore the faster the building is going to cool. So in cold climates or cold weather, we want low thermal conductivity. But the other thing is also, the thicker the walls, the slower the heat is going to be transferred, and the slower the building will cool. This applies to other materials as well, for example windows, roofs, and other materials like the door that connects to the outside. And we need to think of the idea that thermal conductivity and the thickness of the material both contribute to how rapidly that building will cool, based on those relationships that we've made a note of on the screen there.